It's primarily a conference for IT specialists, so let's start with AI. What are some standout examples of successful AI applications in the UK?
Yes, so I think there are 2 or 3 different areas, I would say. The first is diagnostics. And there's a lot of investment that has gone into imaging-based diagnostics, digital pathology as well. I would say imaging is ahead in terms of producing really strong innovation. Couple of examples. You have Chiron, which is a breast cancer application, which is now being rolled out across the NHS for quicker and earlier identification of breast cancer. You have Behold.ai that does lung cancer scanning, which was originally produced for lung cancer, but during COVID, it was also adapted to identify COVID through chest X-rays and so on. So, it's a good example of how adaptable technology is around the AI space. And also, I think from an access perspective, i.e. the general access perspective, because diagnostics is just one piece. You want to enable better access to healthcare, and that applies to lots of populations, not just developed as well. So you had primary care on a national level. In the pandemic, because people weren't going and seeing their GPs, there was a national system for triaging applications, triaging patient requests that came in using AI so that they could be directed better towards maybe the GP or a hospital or a clinic. So again, these are 2 examples of one on kind of individual health setting space, but also on a kind of national level.
And what about the law system and regulations? Is it prepared in the UK for AI?
So this is where I was talking about the multi-agency service. Now, if you look at the way the different players in that service work, so you have the MHRA, which talks about safety. So that's just saying, is this safe or not? Then you've got the National Institute for Clinical Excellence. That says, is this cost effective or not? So obviously, as a state-funded system, you want to make sure that something is cost effective. And then you have other elements that come together around, does this do what it says it's going to do, and all of these things. So for AI, I think the challenge is where you have something that is evolving all the time, how do you say that it may be safe now, and it may be effective now, but as it continues to evolve, will it remain so in the future? And so I think I won't say exactly what the approach is, but the multi-agency service is now addressing that question by coming together as a joint service rather than acting independently. But there's no doubt that you will have to find a way of regulating it at different points in time, or regulating different aspects at different points in time.
And what about motivation of healthcare professionals? How do you feel it in the UK?
I think it's changing. There was a level of maybe suspicion or mistrust around AI before. But when you look at the backlog that you have, and take, for example, radiology and X-rays, there's a huge backlog of X-rays that need to be read. Some of them may be normal, some of them may have something. And you have solutions that will allow you to get rid of some of that backlog. But you have to give it a bit of trust in that sense to say that it's either this or nothing. And that is the choice that many people are faced with. You either use the AI or you wait for months before you can find a human to go through that. So I think there's almost in some ways people are being forced to adopt it, not because it's unsafe, but because they just didn't do it before and now they have to do it because of the backlog.
Let's go to data. Slovakia is really struggling with the data system and in our healthcare system. What are recommendations? How to build it, the whole system? What are the priorities? I know it is a very difficult question.
Yes, so I think there's two ways of looking at data. There's the primary use of data, and then there's the secondary uses. The primary use is all about how do you deliver care using better data? And I think that is a clinically led view. So I think for the NHS, it's very much about saying to the clinicians, what do you need to deliver care to this patient in this scenario? It's taking certain use cases and saying in this case, so if it's an emergency case, you'll need a different set of data. You may have to do with a smaller set of data. What's the minimum set that you need to make that happen? And I think it's been very clear that when we have developed this in the past, there has been a lot of consultation with different groups, so patient groups, clinician groups, administrators, to say what data requirements do you have. But it's not been smooth sailing on the UK end, right? So you had a national program in 2005 that was kicked off with the grand vision of creating a big national health record. But then patient groups said, well, we are worried about what's going to happen in terms of privacy for a lot of this. So you had different concerns that came up. So eventually, to arrive at something everybody was happy with, it got cut down to a summary care record, which was more used for emergency care, with the idea that we'll grow this over time. As people become, as things become more acceptable, we'll bring more things into it. And that was the approach that was taken. Rather than going for something which was perfect, it was to find something that was acceptable and grow it. Today, from a primary perspective, the default consent from a patient is to opt in. You assume consent, and that anybody who's involved in the primary, in the sense of giving care to that patient, has access to that data. Secondary uses is completely different, where you have much more concerns around commercial, how commercially active is this system in terms of giving data out, how do you safeguard patients, how do you create more, protect confidentiality, and so on and so forth. So I think, in terms of identifying what data is needed, that has to be a consultative approach. If it hasn't happened already, then it needs to happen. Otherwise, from a secondary perspective, it's making sure the legislation is there, security standards are there, and there is some kind of independent oversight, which is outside the health system, but it is made up of key people who have an interest, key groups who have an interest, such as patient groups or clinical groups.
In the morning, we talked a lot about innovative treatment, and most of the innovations are quite expensive. How to find a balance? As you probably know, the Slovakian GDP is not so high as in the UK. So how to find the balance between expenses and innovations?
I mean, I would say that one of the key outputs of innovation should be to lower the expense of the treatment. And I think it boils down to trust and adoption. Because even if an innovation is cheaper, is better than what's currently available, you still have the problem of adoption. So for example, and we were working with a company in the UK called CMR Surgical. They develop surgical robots, and they take a different approach to what is currently out there, and they have produced a lower cost innovation. So you can create a surgical robotic operation out of much less of an investment. But even there, if you look at how quickly that can grow within the healthcare system, there are always barriers around procurement, around how you can incentivize the system to adopt technology. Because even if it is great and it fulfills a need, the system is slow to adopt technology. And that's common across all parts of the world.
You had your point, patient-centric care beyond traditional boundaries. It is a universal challenge. What are the recent improvements have been implemented in the UK?
So let me give you an example. Remote monitoring of patients at home. The technology has been there from about 2007. 16 years later, we are now adopting it for virtual wards, because we know that we can't look after patients in the hospital for as long as we were before. So the idea is, can we discharge those patients into the community and provide a monitoring solution that looks after them and allows clinicians to look after them remotely. So this is now growing because all of a sudden you realize you cannot, it's not sustainable post-pandemic, post all the pressures that you have to carry on looking after patients in the clinic or in the hospital. So here's an example of where you are now taking care to where the patient is. I'll give you another example. There's a company called Orca in the UK that does trusted app libraries, and they work with different governments. When you talk about self-care, if you are sponsoring that ecosystem as a government, you want to know that everything in that ecosystem is safe and trusted. So there's an app, so through Orca, you now have a way of accessing apps that are safe, that say a government if they want to say, here's a set of apps that you, the population, can use to look after yourself, here it is. So I think there's another aspect of how you're making care more patient-centric and empowering patients more through the digital means.
Thank you for the really interesting conversation.